Africa has 25% of the global burden of disease health-wise, but only less than 3% of participation in global clinical trials. I think it's important to also add the layer that the projected population dynamic changes that are coming look to also have Africa holding 25% of the world's population in the next 2 decades or so. And those numbers are interesting because then it really speaks to the disparity that we have. And that disparity is not accidental. It's actually because of structural barriers. And so you're asking, what are those barriers? I think there's 3 major barriers that we can work on or have already started shifting. And the first one, which has gained a lot of attention, I think, in the recent past, is the regulatory fragmentation. So when you have or you're trying to run a clinical trial in multiple African countries, that means currently you have to navigate multiple approval pathways. And that is, to put it mildly, quite a nightmare to get through. We now have the Africa Medicines Agency, which is active, and one of its mandates is bringing this harmonization, so the regulatory harmonization bit. And I think this is quite a significant development that will, for one, really change the trajectory of one of the biggest structural barriers that is there. The second one is infrastructure and trust. So this, I'm referring to the sites, the research centers, the investigators of these sites and their teams, and the community partnerships that we require to actually build that trust in, so that the benefit of clinical trials is actually realized down to the people who are participating in it. And the third barrier, which to me I feel is probably the deepest one, is mindset. And that's a collective mindset on both sides of the equation. For the longest time, it has been that Africa has been treated as a recruitment ground for patients, especially patients of sub-Saharan African origin, because that's the biggest gap that we have in global data, and not involving Africa as a partner in developing science, right? That's actually what we have done. So to change this permanently, how do we do that? That's what you asked. I think one of the easiest ways, first of all, is to involve African researchers in developing global trial protocols, to have their voice, to let them ask the questions. So when we're looking at outcomes, is it actually going to be relevant, or what can they contribute? That's a really easy way. We have an opportunity, as I've talked about the regulator, AMA, is to have African regulators really setting the standard of what should be happening in terms of the infrastructure around the ecosystem in Africa. And the African genetic and epidemiological diversity that we have on the continent is really scientifically irreplaceable. And we know that from the scientific community, but I think it needs to be treated as the asset that it really is. When we talk about the changes that are needed and having diversity in clinical trials, it's not a tick box exercise. Medicines that are developed to serve African patients cannot be developed without involving African patients and African patients globally. So I'm not talking just about the 1.5 billion who are domiciled on the continent, right? Today I'm sitting here, we're not in Africa. And this includes then African patients around the world, what we call the diaspora, but a lot of people who are also of African ancestry. And when you bring all of that together, then you realize this is a significant chunk of humanity that is being underserved because they're not part of the process of developing therapies that are working. So we can't actually confidently say that this is the best treatment that's being offered to everybody. So I really think that permanent change happens when equity is built into the architecture of the whole research space. So that goes from the regulations to the infrastructure to the ownership and the outcomes that come from it.